What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. I'm your host, Bill Bafflestone. So today we're having another episode of my Deep Dive series, this time looking at the Contingency spell. I haven't forgotten that I'm in the middle of a fighter series. I just got a little burned out, if I'm being honest, after the Battlemaster videos, because that was a tremendous amount of work. So I just wanted to do a few other things before jumping back into the fighter series, which I do plan on continuing tomorrow. And I personally have been thinking about Contingency a lot because my character, Bill Bafflestone, is very close to 11th level, so I have been putting in a lot of research and thought into this just for my own personal needs, and I figured I may as well make a video about it. I'm going to walk you through my thought process as I'm continuing various contingency options, because I don't want to make a final prescription or anything. A contingency is very much dependent on how your character is currently set up. So by walking you through my thinking, you'll be able to evaluate those arguments relative to your own character, and maybe you'll come to a different conclusion than I did when it comes to what I want as my contingency spell. Before we dive into that, I do want to mention that by the time you see this video, I should be at 1,000 subscribers. And so I just wanted to say thank you so much for all of your support. When I got this gig going, I didn't really think about how successful it might be. I mostly just wanted to talk a little bit about the game from a holistic perspective. My first 7 videos were all part of a series and a series of thoughts that I wanted to get out. And it just turned out to be so fun, and it was so cool to get engagement from all of you guys that it just kind of took on some momentum. And now I'm really all in on this. And it's just so cool to reach this 1,000 subscriber milestone, because I don't know if you're aware, but that's the point at which you can get monetized. So thank you so much for helping me achieve this, and it just makes me want to do an even better job for all of you folks. So that said, let's jump into this contingency thing. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of looking over specific spells, there are a few general considerations that I pondered as I was thinking about contingency. And the first thing I want to point out is that it seems to me the biggest benefit of contingency is to action economy. The benefit to resource management, an extra slot essentially, is fairly marginal, because I can always use those slots as my normal actions. What you want out of a contingency is something that will make an immediate impact the second that the contingent condition is met, without requiring it to be your turn, without requiring any of your resources, and ideally something that's capable of addressing something that you cannot address yourself with your next action. As such, it seems to me that we, or I, should avoid options that are equally effective if actively cast as an action, and thus really take advantage of the fact that contingency pops in the instant the condition is met. Now, the trigger must be a certain circumstance which you describe. This trigger can be either active or passive, but the first thing we've really got to consider is that this is an extremely broad definition. It doesn't seem to include character knowledge. It doesn't seem to include any way to evade or deceive. So this can make it a quasi-divination spell that is, quite frankly, overpowered. That's because specifying a trigger about an unknown event proves that event, and this intel can be more valuable than the actual contingent effect. For example, if your contingency is see invisible when an invisible person gets within line of sight, the fact that it kicks in alerts you to the fact that there is an invisible creature in the area. And if you think about it, being able to test or prove any hypothesis is simply world-changing, and so therefore talk to your DM about it, because he is inevitably going to limit these triggers in his campaign. So you're going to have to figure that out. Talk about the hidden condition, whether it works against things protected by non-detection, how much can you metagame your HP levels, can it detect alignments, and things of that nature. So in considering active triggers, we do note that active triggers must be initiated by the caster, for example, with a command word, an eye blink pattern, some sort of somatic activity, etc. So the active trigger tactic essentially uses contingency as an additional spell slot with better action economy. And I must point out that even though triggering it is a free action, an active trigger can only be activated on your turn. So the upside of this is that active triggers are initiated by choice, they're not scenario dependent, and you have a lot of control over when they go off. However, this does leave the possibility that your active trigger can't be activated. Your command word will not work in silence. Your somatic eye blink pattern is not going to work if you are paralyzed. So I tend to prefer a passive trigger, and a passive trigger is initiated by a circumstantial scenario or condition. For example, you are attacked, you suffer a specified percentage of hit point damage, you're attacked by certain offense types, etc. So this is essentially using contingency as a specific defense. And as a defensive-minded player, that's what I'm looking for out of my contingency. Do note that the passive trigger happens after the trigger action or effect sticks. It can't preempt the action or effect. Some will point to shield and say, oh, well, shield can do it. But shield is a reaction, and you can't put reactions in your contingency spell. So I don't see that that works, but again, talk to your DM, he might disagree. And of course, the benefit of a passive trigger is that it takes effect at any time, not just on your turn, and it will take effect even if you can't normally take actions in that moment, due to being paralyzed or whatever. In terms of your passive trigger options, the choice of trigger is dependent on the current state of your defensive suite, so people are going to prioritize different things. But in my opinion, it's better to fill holes in your specific defenses before creating redundancy. I can see people disagreeing with that. Redundancy is fantastic if you are facing particular offenses consistently, but I prefer to fill holes in specific defenses. So some of these options can be that you take any damage at all, could be that you take enough damage to reduce your hit points to a certain percentage, although what your hit points are is sort of metagaming, so ask your DM how he handles it. And this is probably the most common trigger type I found in my research. And my criticism of this tactic is that a defense versus high damage levels is hugely redundant. I mean, I already have a ton of defenses devoted to protecting me against high damage levels. So stacking on a contingency on top of that, it doesn't seem to me to be the way to get the most out of the spell. You could have it trigger when you are attacked by a specific damage type. And this can be useful in specific conditions, like you're about to storm a red dragon lair or something, but not so much in general unless it's a big hole versus a very common type of damage in your campaign. You could trigger it when a debilitating condition is imposed, for example, paralysis, restrained, grappled, blinded, poisoned, charmed, etc. And this is very useful if you don't already have specific defenses in place for that particular type of offense. However, it may be too niche, as the contingent circumstance is limited to a single option. So you really have to word it properly to cover a bunch of conditions, and you're definitely going to be leaving some out. That's not an issue if you already have defenses for those particular conditions, but again, it's going to vary from PC to PC. The passive trigger can go off when a debilitating environment is imposed. For example, underwater, you're falling, you're in lava now, you're facing difficult terrain, etc. This also may be too niche as a contingent circumstance because you have to limit it to a single option. Or you could do X appears within Y distance. That's one that I've considered, but it is metagaming, so you've got to talk to the DM about how he would handle that sort of particular trigger. So those are the general considerations. Then I started looking at specific spells that I wanted to use under certain circumstances. And I can't cover them all because there's just way too many spells out there, but I did research this pretty heavily and looked at all of the ones that are commonly employed and even not so commonly employed. And there were a few that people suggested that I considered but almost immediately dismissed. One was Feign Death. Some people do like that. It's very tricksy, but to me it's too dependent on NPC reactions. I mean, do they even notice that you're dead? Maybe they put on the coup de grace anyway. I considered Mirror Image, Blur, False Life 5, Armor Agathis 5, Cure Wounds 5. To me, all of these are just too weak for contingency. There are stronger options. Dispel Evil and Good, the defense is too weak, and as an offense, you don't require better action economy, you just cast Banish or something. Remove Curse, didn't seem to me to benefit from the better action economy. If I need to remove a curse, I'll just cast it on my turn. Water breathing didn't seem to be any benefit because I already cast that every day. It's just a 3rd level ritual. And Far Step requires concentration, so I'm not going to pick that over other teleport options. So now let's look at good passive contingent spell options, ones that I thought were worthy of consideration. I've divided them into concentration and non-concentration options because I think it is a very important distinction. We have to note that concentration options are inherently risky. Some conditions end it. If you're incapacitated or unconscious or banished, you can't concentrate on any spells and your contingency spell will just go to waste. And of course, losing your current concentration spell is hugely debilitating. If you're in the middle of combat, you've probably got a really good concentration spell going, and for your contingency to ruin that might be critical. That said, if the effect of the spell is really impactful, it might be worth occupying your concentration, so I did consider a few options. One is your favorite concentration spell, because you can set it up where if you lose your concentration on it, it'll just immediately recast the spell. For example, Polymorph, Haste, Greater Invisibility, and this is the ultimate redundancy option, so it's probably appealing to people who are offensive-minded and want to keep it going even if they break their concentration, to a defensive-minded player looking to fill specific holes against specific offenses. It's not as appealing. As I said, I'm not as attracted to redundancy as I am to filling holes. Next, I consider Resilient Sphere. This is hands down the most powerful defensive option. It will protect from virtually every offense in the game except Disintegrate, and that's very attractive to a defensive-minded player. It is difficult to create offense from, however, but otherwise a really fantastic option. It would be virtually a no-brainer for the defensive-minded, if not for the fact that it is a concentration spell. Polymorph is another good option. It has a powerful impact by conferring a massive pool of hit points, and it is an offensively powerful option. However, you will get hit pretty frequently. The armor classes of polymorph forms isn't great, and when you get hit, you're going to require a concentration check, so you could theoretically lose the form immediately if you're attacked. And that's not good synergy with the fact that you're probably going to be kicking this in at a certain level of damage taken. And so as protection from further damage, it's quite problematic that you can drop your concentration on it. We also can't forget that the best forms for polymorph are huge in size, and if it triggers in a space that's overly constrained, I don't know how your DM is going to handle it, but it's probably not going to be in a way that works for you. Greater Invisibility is an option, and it's pretty powerful offensively. You get your attacks at advantage. Personally, I find the defense that it offers pretty marginal. They still know where you are. They're just attacking you at disadvantage. You may have that arranged already, and if it pops against a creature that has senses that can defeat it, then you just lost your contingency. Haste is an interesting option. That immediate bump to AC is really nice if you're eating a Nova and it goes off on the first hit, and it will therefore affect all of the other hits that are probably coming your way. And defensively, that improved speed is fantastic as well. You might have to retreat, and moving double speed is pretty nice when that happens. And it is an offensively powerful option. So haste is also pretty good, but again, it's concentration, so is it really that good? I don't know. The final concentration option that I considered was Mislead, which is a pretty strong defensive option, and it's definitely appealing to the set that likes to be really tricksy, and I can see it being really amazing in certain scenarios. It is, again, easily defeated by many creatures' senses, but an interesting option. I could definitely see people picking Mislead, even though it's concentration, because, it uses tricksiness to avoid further attack. But those are all of the concentration options that I thought might make sense. Now let's look at the no concentration ones. And honestly, I personally can't bring myself to consider a concentration option. It's just too risky, and I'm all about reducing risk, so I'm almost certainly going to choose a no concentration option. And one of the most popular options is Dimension Door. I mean, you're in a dangerous situation, you teleport out, that sounds good to me. It is a little unwieldy, as the teleport location must be specified by direction and distance at the time of casting. Now that's rules as written. Your DM might say otherwise, in which case Dimension Door is a much stronger option. But it's still pretty good even if you do have to specify the direction and distance. 500 feet straight up is a pretty common option, and then you just feather fall down or whatever. But it might result in suboptimal positioning based on your current environment. Like if you're on a spell jammer or something, you might just eject yourself out into the plains or whatever. Or if you're underwater or underground, maybe you teleport it straight into water or rock, and that's not good. And a 500-foot range might not be enough to escape. So a little risky in that regard. And then finally, just from a holistic perspective, it means you're abandoning the party. And I am not generally down with abandoning the party, so Dimension Door is not super attractive to me. Another great option is Freedom of Movement, which is a cleric spell, so it's not available to most wizards. If you don't have this available, like Dispel Magic or Gaseous Form is probably like the closest alternatives. Although I'm not attracted to Gaseous Form because it's a concentration spell. And Freedom of Movement is a really nice counter for when you're paralyzed, restrained, grappled, or facing difficult terrain. Now keep in mind you only get a single triggering circumstance, so you have to word it carefully, but I'm pretty sure that if I go with any time my move is unwilling reduced, that's going to be sufficient to cover most of those conditions. And one of the reasons that I like this is that it's one of the only defenses available versus restrained plus silence. We have to remember that teleportation scrolls won't work against many sources of the restrained condition. For example, Everard's Black Tentacles. Now, I will admit that this is something of a controversial ruling. Some DMs will have the restrained condition of Everard's follow you if you teleport, others won't. My DM does interpret it that way, so for me, a scroll of Misty Step isn't going to help me if I'm in Everard's Black Tentacles and silenced. So that's a pretty good option. I also considered Blink, which is a very strong defensive spell if cast in round 1, but it's usually not because it's very poor action economy, which the Contingency would solve. However, there are some problems with it. It won't take effect until the end of your next turn, which might be too late if the Contingency is intended as a panic button defense versus a one-turn Nova. They're just going to keep doing damage to you, and you might be dead by the time it's your next turn. As well, there's no point to a passive trigger if the effect doesn't take place until your next turn, because you could just do it on that turn. So an intriguing option if used aggressively. It can impact many battles, unlike most Contingency formulations. But that said, the opportunity cost of constantly casting Contingency is very high. It's a 6th level slot, you don't get many, and if you're using this Blink Contingency combo a lot, you're not casting Mass Suggestion or Programmed Illusion or whatever. I also considered Revivify because this is a very popular one with folks out there. But I have to say, rules as written, it doesn't seem to me that the caster is a valid target at the time of casting, so it shouldn't work. But it's controversial. The DM might allow it, and if so, it's an elite option if you're the only member of the party that can cast Revivify. However, if you have another cleric in the party that can cast Revivify, I wouldn't be so attracted to it and just let party synergy handle that particular sort of thing. I considered Dispel Magic 5, which is a very powerful option that affects many conditions. If you don't want an active trigger, it can be a passive one, something to the effect of like when affected by a spell that I've attempted but failed to counterspell. Otherwise, it might be hard to define a wide range of spells that it can go off against since you're limited to just one circumstance. However, it will remove any of your own protective spells, or I guess they don't have to be protective, but like whatever you have cast on you is also going to get dispelled. And frankly, you can often just cast it as your next action if you need to. You really only can't do that if you're paralyzed or incapacitated. And so against those, I feel like a different option would be better. I think Death Ward is a great option. Again, a cleric spell, so not available to most wizards, but if you can cast it, it's interesting. We have to note that it is already a contingent spell by itself, just, reading its own description. So it's problematic in that it can't trigger it directly when you're reduced to 0 hit points because the reduction happens first. So it's probably best to use this to trigger when your current Death Ward procs, and that way there's something that you're going to need Death Ward against, or you're in that circumstance where you need it. And if you need it once, you're probably going to need it a second time. So that is intriguing. So See Invisible was also intriguing. It has a really long effect. because it has line of sight range, and it's pretty solid if the trigger can also be line of sight or even like a specified distance, like an invisible creature comes within 1,000 feet of me or some such. But that is metagaming a bit. It's going to be up to the DM whether that's valid or not. But if so, that is intriguing because I hate being plagued by invisible creatures, and it's not always easy to know when to use see invisibility. I currently use my bat for that mostly, but he has only a 60-foot blind sight. So that one is intriguing. Featherfall is another one that I considered, but to me that just protects against a weak circumstance. I mean, the maximum damage you can take from falling is only 70, although there is some interest to it if you can fly and you might fall if they prone you or something. So it is great to have, but ultimately a scroll or a tattoo of this just seems like a better option given the opportunity cost, and that is a first level spell. So scrolls or tattoos are common. I considered non-detection, which is an interesting option if you know that you're being scryed upon on occasion, but it's actually pretty easy to scry on people, and so if they just scry on another party member, they're probably going to screw you just as badly. So to me, the marginal benefit is questionable. And note that if it triggers a lot, then you're just going to be forced to devote a 6th level slot to contingency. So huge opportunity cost there. So to me, if you're really worried about getting scryed a lot, it's probably better just to devote 2 3rd level spell slots to it instead of a 3rd and a 6th. And note that in these calculations, I'm presuming you only need 2 per day at 8-hour duration each, because if you're in a long rest and in a tiny hut, you're probably not going to need it, at least as I see it. Who knows what your DM says about that, though. I considered Fire Shield. That's pretty solid versus fire or cold damage. Some people like the retribution damage, but it is somewhat redundant if you already have Absorb Elements, which I do, and I'm not so attracted to the offensive benefits. And I did consider Greater Restoration. That's actually a pretty solid defense versus the Petrified and Charmed conditions, as well as being feeble-minded. But the other conditions that it fixes are not that debilitating, so I don't see why it's a huge advantage to remove them instantly as opposed to on my next action. And note that Lesser Restoration offers a similar defense versus Paralyzed. Probably not as good as Freedom of Movement, but Lesser Restoration is only 2nd level, and you might not have 4th level Cleric spells available. So after considering all of these spells and all of the general considerations, for me, the final winner is Freedom of Movement versus any unwilling reduction to movement speed. I can cast Freedom of Movement, so no issues there. Resilient Sphere is super tempting. I love an ultimate defense, but ultimately, I just gotta have a no concentration option. That said, if you're not put off by the concentration requirement, it's probably the best option. It's just such a powerful defense. Death Ward was also very tempting, but ultimately I thought Freedom of Movement addressed a greater threat and filled a bigger hole for me. Greater Restoration was also tempting, but it's available to my allies as well, so not the hugest benefit of proccing it on myself. See Invisible was also tempting, but I'm hesitant to approach my DM about it because the trigger that I want is fairly OP, and if it's not at that OP level, then it's just redundant with my current detection suite. So unless I get a significant benefit out of it, hence the OP ask, it's not as appealing as Freedom of Movement. And the reason I want Freedom of Movement is that I have 2 holes in my specific defenses that this would close, and I hate having holes in my specific defenses because if the DM ever figures them out, then I'm screwed. But I don't care if he knows about them now because I will have filled those holes by having a contingent Freedom of Movement. And those specifically are the Paralyzed condition and Restrained plus Silence. Grapple plus Silence is fine because I can use a Scroll of Misty Step for that, but not Restrained plus Silence. So those are 2 specific holes that I have always been trying to close. It's just that there's so many to close that I've addressed others first. And so to close these really gets my attention and really makes me sleep better at night. Not to mention the fact that it's just extremely useful in many other scenarios. I mean, I use Sleet Storm all the time, so having Freedom of Movement kick in if I have to Sleet Storm my entire area is going to be very nice. So that's what I'm going with as soon as I get to 11th level. Contingent Freedom of Movement versus any unwilling reduction to my move. So that's it. That's my thought process and how I looked at things and why I decided to go with Freedom of Movement as my contingent spell. But let me know what you think in the comments. Am I being stupid? Is there some other thing that I could do that is just as good? Have I not considered a really awesome option that you like to use? Let me know. And regardless, thank you so much for watching. This has been the Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition Power Gamers Tactics Room. I'm your host, Bill Bafflestone. See you next time.